My name is Vivian Brooks, and I was 34 when my stepmother stood in front of my father's funeral chapel and told me I wasn't welcome. The words themselves weren't surprising. The timing was. The chapel doors were already open behind her. I could hear the low murmur of voices, the soft hum of the air conditioning, and the distant notes of an organ warming up inside. My father's casket was less than 40 feet away, and Denise had positioned herself directly between me and him. "You need to leave," she said. Her chin lifted slightly as she spoke, the same way it always did when she believed she had already won. I looked past her toward the chapel entrance. Then I looked back at the folder in my hand. A thin folder. 9 pages. 3 signatures. 1 date. And a document that had been sitting in my father's safe for almost 6 years. Denise thought she was keeping me out of the funeral. What she didn't know was that by the end of that afternoon, her wedding plans, her future, and nearly everything she thought she owned would exist only on paper. And paper, as I've learned, can be very unforgiving. But we'll get to that. Welcome back to Home of Secrets, where every house has a secret room, and the woman they forgot about has had the key the whole time. Before we continue, let me know where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel, and if you enjoy stories about documentation, receipts, family secrets, and the quiet power of preparation, subscribe. It helps more than you know. Now let's go back to the beginning. Long before the funeral. Long before the safe. Long before Denise learned that confidence and ownership are 2 very different things. The town was called Hollow Creek. Population 3,182. 1 diner, 1 church, 1 traffic light, and exactly the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, but rarely knew the truth. The diner sat across from the courthouse. The church sat 2 blocks away, and our family home stood on 6 acres just outside town, where the road narrowed and the mailboxes became farther apart. The house had white siding that constantly needed paint, a wraparound porch, 3 bedrooms, and a detached workshop where my father spent most weekends repairing things that weren't broken. When I think about that house, I remember smells before anything else. Fresh-cut cedar, motor oil, coffee brewing before sunrise, rain hitting the metal roof over the workshop. The sound always arrived a few seconds before the storm. Like a warning. My father, Harold Brooks, owned a small construction company. Nothing glamorous. 7 employees, 3 trucks, 1 office manager. But it paid the bills. People trusted him. And in towns like Hollow Creek, trust was worth more than advertising. My mother died when I was 12. A sudden aneurysm. One day, she was helping me study for a science test. 2 days later, she was gone. After that, it was mostly my father and me. We developed routines. Saturday breakfasts at the diner. Sunday afternoons fixing fences. Friday nights reviewing invoices together. Numbers fascinated me even then. While other kids hated spreadsheets, I loved them. Patterns made sense. Records made sense. Documentation made sense. People often didn't. My father used to joke that I could find a missing penny in a state budget. At 16, I was balancing books for local businesses. At 18, I left for college. At 22, I graduated with a degree in accounting and compliance management. At 26, I became a forensic accountant, which sounds exciting until you realize most of the job involves reading documents for 8 hours straight. But I loved it, because documents don't lie. People do. 5 years after my mother died, Denise Carter arrived. She worked at a regional bank 30 miles away. Divorced, attractive, confident, always perfectly dressed. She had a smile that appeared quickly and disappeared just as fast. The town loved her immediately. My father did too. Within 18 months, they were married. At first, I genuinely tried. I sent flowers, invited her to lunch, helped her settle into the house. I wanted peace. More than that, I wanted my father to be happy. But Denise approached relationships the way some people approach real estate. Everything had value. Everything had a use. Everything belonged to someone. And she liked knowing who that someone was. The first warning came 6 months after the wedding. A small thing. Easy to ignore. I came home for Thanksgiving. The family photo wall in the hallway had changed. My childhood photos had been moved. Not removed. Just moved. From the main hallway to a side corridor leading toward the laundry room. There were 23 framed photographs. 21 now featured Denise. Only 2 featured me. I noticed. Denise noticed me noticing. Then she smiled. It's important to keep things updated. I remember staring at the wall for exactly 5 seconds. I counted. Then I nodded, because arguing over photographs felt ridiculous, at least at the time. The second warning came 2 years later. My father's business held its annual Christmas dinner. Every employee attended. Spouses attended. Families attended. During dinner, one of the suppliers congratulated my father. "You must be proud," he said. "Vivian's doing incredible work." Before my father could answer, Denise spoke. "Oh, she just works with spreadsheets." Just. The word landed quietly, like dust settling on furniture. Most people wouldn't have noticed. I did. My father did too. He opened his mouth, then closed it. And that told me more than anything he could have said, because silence has weight, especially from people who know better. Over the next 4 years, the pattern continued. Small things, tiny things, things easy to dismiss individually, but impossible to ignore collectively. Holiday invitations arriving late, family decisions made without me, stories retold with details altered, achievements minimized, contributions forgotten. And every time, Denise presented herself as perfectly reasonable. That's what made her effective. Nothing was dramatic enough to confront. Everything was just small enough to explain away. Like weather you stop noticing. Until one day you realize you're standing in a flood. The first person who saw it clearly wasn't my father. It was our elderly neighbor, Frank Mercer. Frank had lived next door for 38 years. Retired mechanic. Vietnam veteran. The kind of man who spoke only when he had something worth saying. One afternoon, he watched Denise interrupt me 3 times during a barbecue. After she walked away, Frank handed me a glass of lemonade. Then he said something I wouldn't understand until years later. Keep records. That's all he said. 2 words. Keep records. I laughed. I'm an accountant, Frank. He nodded. Good. Then he took another sip and looked toward the house. The screen door closed somewhere behind us with a soft click. Frank's advice stayed with me. Not because it sounded profound. It didn't. It sounded obvious. The sort of thing you'd find stitched onto a pillow in a waiting room. But over the next several years, I found myself thinking about it more often than I expected. Keep records. So I did. Not because I thought Denise was plotting anything. Not because I was preparing for a fight. Simply because documentation was how my mind worked. If a conversation mattered, I made notes. If an agreement was reached, I confirmed it in writing. If money moved, I tracked where it came from and where it went. It wasn't paranoia. It was procedure. The same procedure that paid my mortgage. The same procedure that had built my career. And eventually, the same procedure that would save me. The first real crack appeared when I was 29. My father called me on a Tuesday evening, 7:14 p.m. I remember because the timestamp still exists in my phone records. His voice sounded tired. Not sick, not weak, just tired. "Can you look at something for me?" he asked. "Of course. It's probably nothing." People almost always say that right before it turns out to be something. The next day, he emailed me 6 bank statements, 3 credit card summaries, 2 loan documents, and a spreadsheet Denise had prepared. I spent 43 minutes reviewing everything. Then I called him back. "How much of this have you looked at?" There was silence. 8 seconds. I counted. Not much. That answer told me everything. Denise had gradually taken over most household finances. At first, it made sense. She worked at a bank. She understood paperwork. My father hated paperwork. The arrangement looked practical. Until I started reading. 3 personal loans, 1 home equity line, 2 credit cards carrying balances totaling $41,783, several withdrawals that lacked supporting records. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, but enough to concern me. When I asked Denise about it during Sunday dinner, she laughed. Actually laughed. "Oh, Vivian," she stirred her iced tea, "you see problems, because that's your job." The table went quiet. My father stared at his plate. I let it go. Not because I believed her, because I already had the numbers. And numbers don't become more truthful when people argue about them. Over the next 18 months, the debt grew. Not rapidly, slowly, like water finding cracks in a foundation. By the time my father turned 62, the balances exceeded $87,000. Again, not catastrophic, but unusual, especially for someone who had spent 3 decades avoiding debt. I showed him comparisons, graphs, historical spending reports, 3-year trends, the kind of analysis I prepared for corporate fraud investigations. He listened carefully. Then he sighed. "Denise says everything's under control." I remember looking at him, really looking, and realizing something uncomfortable. He wasn't asking me because he wanted answers. He was asking because he wanted reassurance. Those are very different things. One seeks truth. The other seeks comfort. And truth is rarely comfortable. A year later, Harold received a diagnosis. Early-stage congestive heart failure. Treatable. Manageable. But serious. The call came on March 17th, a Thursday. The cardiologist recommended lifestyle changes, medication, monitoring. Nothing immediate, nothing catastrophic. But mortality entered the room that day and never really left. Denise changed after that, not publicly. Publicly, she became attentive, devoted, protective, the picture of a caring spouse. Privately, something else emerged. Conversations began revolving around assets, property, beneficiaries, ownership, future planning, words that sounded responsible until you noticed how often they appeared. One evening, she asked me a question while we were cleaning dishes. The kitchen window was open, crickets outside, running water in the sink. What happens if something happens to Harold? I dried a plate. Legally? Financially? There it was. Not grief, not concern, not fear. Financially. I gave her the standard answer. Depends on estate planning, beneficiary designations, ownership structures, trust documents. The answer seemed to disappoint her, as though she had hoped for something simpler. A year later, my father asked me to review his estate documents. That wasn't unusual. I had reviewed dozens for clients. This one simply happened to belong to my father. We met at Eleanor Finch's office. Eleanor had practiced estate law in Hollow Creek for 31 years. She knew every property line, every family feud, and every inheritance dispute within 50 miles. The office smelled faintly of old paper and coffee, two scents that never seemed to disappear from law firms. My father arrived carrying a worn leather folder. Eleanor arrived carrying a thicker one. Denise arrived 10 minutes late. She looked annoyed, not worried. Annoyed, as though the meeting itself was an inconvenience. For nearly 2 hours we reviewed everything: property deeds, business interests, insurance policies, retirement accounts, beneficiary designations, every document, every signature, every date. When the meeting ended, my father remained behind. Just him, Eleanor, and me. Denise had already left, as soon as the formal discussion concluded. My father waited until her car disappeared from the parking lot. Then he closed the office door. The sound was soft, but deliberate. He sat back down, folded his hands, and looked at Eleanor, then at me. I want to make a change. The room became very quiet, not uncomfortable, intentional. Eleanor opened a yellow legal pad. My father spoke carefully, slowly, like a man measuring each word before spending it. I want certain documents placed in the safe. I frowned. What documents? His eyes met mine, then shifted briefly toward Eleanor. She didn't react, which immediately told me she already knew, or suspected. What kind of documents? I asked again. This time he smiled. A tired smile. The kind older people wear when they've finally accepted something they hoped wasn't true. The kind people only need when they stop believing promises. Outside, rain began tapping against the office windows. Soft at first, then harder, like fingers drumming on glass. I didn't ask him what he meant. Not immediately. Partly because I already suspected, and partly because people sometimes tell the truth more clearly when you let silence do the work. Eleanor waited. My father looked down at the table, then toward the rain outside. Finally he spoke. Denise thinks planning is the same thing as ownership. The statement sounded strange until I thought about it. Then it sounded painfully accurate. For years, Denise had treated every conversation about the future as if the future already belonged to her. She referred to property as our property, business assets as our assets, retirement accounts as our retirement, even when records showed otherwise, even when ownership documents said otherwise. Language matters, especially when repeated often enough. Eventually, people begin treating assumptions like facts. My father wasn't a foolish man, but he was tired. And tired people often choose peace over correction, at least for a while. Eleanor made a few notes, then asked a simple question. Harold, are you concerned someone may challenge your intentions later? The room went quiet. My father didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the leather folder, removed a folded sheet of paper, and slid it across the desk. Toward Eleanor, toward me. I unfolded it. A wedding venue reservation. 200 guests. Deposit paid. Date scheduled 14 months away. I stared at it, then looked up. My father nodded. She hasn't mentioned it to me. That got my attention, because Denise wasn't engaged, at least not officially. My father was still alive, still sitting in front of us. Yet somehow wedding plans already existed. The line between confidence and expectation had apparently disappeared. The room felt colder after that. Not physically, just clear, like a window finally wiped clean. Over the next year I paid closer attention, not because I was investigating, because patterns had become impossible to ignore. The first thing I noticed was timing. Whenever my father's health improved, Denise relaxed. Whenever a doctor's appointment produced concerning results, Denise became intensely interested in paperwork. Insurance paperwork, property paperwork, beneficiary paperwork, trust paperwork. The pattern repeated 11 separate times. I know because I documented each occurrence. Date, time, topic discussed, duration, 11 entries, 11 patterns. The second thing I noticed was isolation. Not dramatic isolation, subtle isolation, the dangerous kind. Phone calls interrupted, visits shortened, plans rearranged, family updates delivered through Denise rather than directly through my father. Every action seemed reasonable by itself. Together, they created distance, and distance creates opportunity. Frank Mercer noticed it too. One afternoon he called me. The call lasted exactly 12 minutes and 41 seconds. I still have the record. "Your dad's not coming around much." I looked up from my laptop. "What do you mean?" "He used to stop by every Tuesday." Pause. "Haven't seen him in 6 weeks." That wasn't normal. Not for Harold. Routine mattered to him. Frank hesitated, then added something else. "Denise answers for him now." 3 words. That was all. But it told me enough. A few days later, I drove home. Officially, I was there to review construction company tax records. Unofficially, I wanted to see my father. The house looked the same. The porch, the workshop, the mailbox. But something felt different. Inside, several pieces of furniture had been replaced. Photographs moved again. More family history removed. More, Denise added. A house tells a story. This one was slowly being edited. When I found my father in the workshop, he looked older. Not dramatically, just noticeably. Like someone carrying weight nobody else could see. We talked for nearly 2 hours. Invoices, weather, football, the usual things. Then, just before I left, he handed me a key. Small, brass, unremarkable, except for what he said next. "If anything happens, call Eleanor." I stared at the key. "What is this?" "The safe." The words landed quietly. He didn't explain further. Didn't need to. I slipped the key into my purse. And for reasons I couldn't fully explain, I never told Denise about it. Not once. Months passed. Then another year. The records continued. Dates, emails, statements, documents, small inconsistencies, growing patterns. Nothing explosive. Just facts. The kind that become important later. Then came the phone call. January 14th, 8:17 p.m. Snow falling outside my office window. Unknown number. Hospital switchboard. I knew before answering. Sometimes your body recognizes a moment before your mind does. My father had suffered a major cardiac event. He survived, but barely. For the first time, mortality stopped being theoretical. Everything accelerated after that. Conversations changed, priorities changed, and Denise stopped pretending. Not completely, just enough. For the first time, she openly discussed inheritance, property, transfers, future ownership, as though the outcome had already been decided. One evening, she made a comment during dinner, a comment she probably expected everyone to forget. I didn't, because I wrote it down 15 minutes later, word for word. After everything settles, I think Gerald and I will finally be able to start our life together. The room went silent. I remember looking at my father, then at Denise, then back at my father, because one detail mattered. Gerald was not my father. Gerald Whitmore was a real estate developer from the next county, and apparently Denise already had plans involving him. Plans she seemed oddly confident about. My father didn't say anything. Neither did I. But later that night, my phone rang. It was Eleanor. Her voice sounded steady, calm, professional. the way mine usually did. "Vivian," she said, "I think it's time we discuss what's actually inside that safe. Before we get to that, I want to ask you something. Have you ever watched someone slowly rewrite reality around a family, telling the same story so many times they started believing it themselves? Let me know in the comments. And if you're enjoying the story so far, subscribe, because this is the point where everything changes. Up until now, I had suspicions, records, patterns, concerns. What Eleanor was about to show me wasn't a concern. It was proof, and proof changes everything. Outside my office, snow tapped softly against the glass. Inside, I opened my notebook and prepared to listen. Outside my office, snow tapped softly against the glass. Inside, I opened my notebook and prepared to listen. Eleanor didn't waste words. She never did. Over 31 years of estate law had trained her to separate facts from stories. And Denise, I would later learn, had been telling quite a few stories. "Your father came to me alone 6 years ago," Eleanor said. I sat forward. What did he want? Protection. The answer surprised me, not because of the word, because of how quickly she said it. No hesitation, no uncertainty. Protection. Eleanor opened a file. The folder looked ordinary, cream-colored, slightly worn, a red tab along one edge. The kind of folder thousands of attorneys use every day. Yet somehow it felt heavier than that. She removed 3 documents, placed them on her desk, then slid them toward me. The first was a property deed. The second was an estate amendment. The third was a notarized statement signed by my father. I read the first page, then read it again. The room became very quiet. So, he knew, Eleanor nodded, long before anyone else. The amendment had been executed 5 years and 8 months earlier, witnessed, notarized, recorded, legally airtight, the family property, the workshop, the 6 acres, the construction company office, several investment accounts. Everything had already been reassigned according to a detailed estate structure, not after his death. Years before it. I looked at Eleanor. "Why didn't he tell me?" She gave a small smile. "Because he wasn't protecting the assets from you." That answer landed heavily, like a weight settling into place. I looked back at the paperwork. Every page carried Harold Brooks's signature. Every page carried dates. Every page carried legal verification. No ambiguity, no loopholes, no uncertainty, just records. The thing Denise never respected, and the thing that would eventually undo her. "What changed his mind?" I asked. Eleanor leaned back, then opened another folder. This one was thicker, much thicker. Inside were copies of emails, bank statements, notes, letters, a timeline, 112 pages, every page numbered, every page dated. I stared at the stack. "You built a case file." "No." Eleanor shook her head. "Your father built it." For several seconds I didn't speak. That surprised me more than anything. My father hated paperwork, avoided it whenever possible. Yet somehow he had assembled 112 pages of documentation. The answer appeared 3 pages later. A printed email, sent by Denise, accidentally copied to the wrong recipient, specifically to a financial advisor who happened to know Harold personally. The advisor forwarded it. The advisor became concerned, and eventually the email found its way to Eleanor. I read it twice, then a third time. The language wasn't illegal, just revealing. Denise discussed projected asset values, estimated property transfers, expected insurance proceeds, future liquidity. The wording sounded less like a spouse discussing family planning and more like an investor evaluating an acquisition. The date on the email mattered, because it had been sent nearly 7 years earlier, before the first health scare, before the first hospital stay, before anyone expected Harold to die, meaning Denise's calculations had started long before illness entered the picture. And once Harold saw that email, he began paying attention, very close attention. According to Eleanor's records, he spent the next 4 years documenting everything: conversations, financial requests, property discussions, beneficiary recommendations, every major interaction, dates, times, notes, 57 separate entries. 57. I counted them myself. The final entry was only 3 months old. The handwriting looked shakier than the earlier pages, but the message was clear. Denise believes ownership follows proximity. She believes being present makes things hers. I need certainty. I had to stop reading for a moment, not because I was emotional, because I suddenly understood something. The safe wasn't a surprise plan. The safe was the final chapter of a plan, already completed years earlier. Denise wasn't trying to take something that might become hers. She was trying to take something that had never belonged to her in the first place. Eleanor reached into another folder. This one contained photographs. 26 photographs. Property records. Meeting records. Copies of beneficiary updates. Insurance confirmations. Trust amendments. Everything cross-referenced. Everything organized. My father had become meticulous, not because he enjoyed paperwork, because paperwork had become necessary. Then Eleanor showed me the document that mattered most, a sealed instruction letter, addressed directly to me. The envelope remained unopened. My name was written across the front in Harold's handwriting. Vivian Brooks. The letters were slightly uneven. Age had affected his hands, but not his intention. "When do I open it?" I asked. Eleanor folded her hands. "After his funeral." The answer felt strange, specific, intentional, as if my father had anticipated a sequence of events. I stared at the envelope, then at Eleanor. "You think something is going to happen?" "I don't think." Her voice remained calm. "I prepare." That sounded familiar, like something I might say. Then she added another sentence, one that stayed with me. "Your father wasn't worried about dying." Pause. He was worried about what would happen immediately afterward. Outside, snow continued falling. Inside, the office felt very still, like the moment before a storm finally reaches the house. And for the first time, I began to suspect that Denise wasn't simply planning for the future. She was already spending it. The clock on Eleanor's wall clicked softly toward 9 o'clock, and neither of us knew how little time remained. The call came 78 days later, 4:52 in the morning. I remember because the number is burned into my memory. Nobody calls at 4:52 a.m. with good news. The phone rang once, then again, then a third time. I was already awake before I answered. Some part of me knew. The hospital administrator spoke carefully, professionally, like someone delivering information that had been delivered too many times before. My father had passed away at 4:11 a.m. Peacefully. That was the word they used. Peacefully. Maybe it was true. Maybe it wasn't. Either way, he was gone. The room felt strangely silent afterward. Not dramatic. Not crushing. Just empty. Like a clock stopping in a house you've lived in your entire life. I sat on the edge of my bed for exactly 19 minutes. No television. No music. No phone calls. Just quiet. Then I called Eleanor. She answered on the second ring, as though she had expected my call. "I'm on my way," she said. Nothing else. Just that. By noon I was driving toward Hollow Creek. The January sky hung low over the highway. Gray. Heavy. the kind of sky that makes everything look unfinished. When I arrived at the family home, Denise's SUV was already parked outside, along with 6 other vehicles. People moved in and out carrying food, flowers, casseroles, condolence cards, the rituals people perform when they don't know what else to do. I parked near the workshop. The workshop door was closed, for the first time in nearly 20 years. Seeing that bothered me more than the funeral arrangements, because workshops can be reopened. People can't. Inside the house, Denise was already directing traffic, telling relatives where to sit, which florist to use, which funeral home had been selected, who should be contacted, who shouldn't. Everything organized, everything controlled, everything moving very quickly, too quickly. I watched for almost 15 minutes before speaking, and during those 15 minutes, something became obvious. Nobody was asking questions, because Denise already had answers prepared. The first strange moment came when my cousin Rachel arrived. She hugged Denise, then said something that made me stop walking. "I know Harold wanted you handling everything." Denise nodded immediately, without hesitation, without correction, without explanation. Just nodded, as though the statement were fact. I made a mental note. 3 hours later, I heard almost the exact same sentence from someone else, then again from someone else, then again. By the end of the evening, I had counted 9 separate people repeating the same idea. Harold wanted Denise handling everything. The wording barely changed. The message remained identical, which told me something important. People weren't remembering. They were repeating, and somebody had given them the script. The next morning, Denise called a family meeting. There were 14 people in attendance. Relatives, family friends, 2 business associates, and me. Denise stood near the fireplace, hands folded, voice carefully controlled. She looked exactly like someone auditioning for sympathy. I know this is difficult. Pause. We're all hurting. Another pause. But Harold made his wishes very clear. There it was again. His wishes. Everyone listened. Nobody questioned. Then Denise outlined funeral plans, visitation, service schedule, burial arrangements, reception details. Every decision already finalized. At no point did she ask for input. At no point did she invite discussion. She simply announced conclusions, like a manager reading policy updates. Then she arrived at the part that mattered. The service will be family only. The room remained quiet, until someone asked the obvious question. What about Vivian? Denise's jaw tightened, just slightly, almost invisible. I think it's best if we avoid unnecessary complications. The words landed flat. Several people exchanged glances. Nobody spoke, but the temperature in the room seemed to change. I counted 7 seconds of silence. Then Denise continued talking as though nothing had happened. Later that afternoon, I received an email. Subject line, "Funeral access list attached," was a PDF. 1 page, 23 names. My name wasn't on it. I read the list twice, then forwarded it directly to Eleanor. 3 minutes later, my phone rang. "Don't respond." That was the first thing she said. Why? Because she's making assumptions. Eleanor sounded calmer than ever, which usually meant something significant had happened. What kind of assumptions? The expensive kind. The line went quiet. Then Eleanor asked a question. "Do you still have the key?" I reached into my purse. The brass key remained exactly where my father had placed it nearly 2 years earlier. Yes. Good. For the first time, I heard something different in her voice. Not concern, not caution, certainty. The safe gets opened tomorrow. The next day, we met at First County Trust. The safe deposit facility occupied the rear section of the bank. No windows, no decoration, just steel doors, security cameras, and records. Thousands and thousands of records. A bank employee escorted us downstairs. The hallway smelled faintly of metal and paper. The sound of our footsteps echoed against concrete walls. Eleanor walked beside me, carrying 2 folders. Nothing more. No dramatic speeches. No warnings. No predictions. Just folders. We stopped in front of box 314. The number meant nothing to me. Yet somehow it felt familiar. The employee inserted 1 key. I inserted the second. The lock clicked. Soft. Precise. Permanent. The employee stepped away, leaving us alone. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then Eleanor opened the box. Inside sat a sealed document envelope, a flash drive, a leather notebook, and 1 smaller envelope addressed directly to me. The handwriting was unmistakable. My father's. The room suddenly felt very still, like a church before a service begins, or a courtroom before a verdict. Eleanor carefully lifted the larger envelope, then looked at me. Vivian. I met her eyes. What? She paused, only briefly, but long enough for the words to matter. Everything Denise thinks she's inheriting is already addressed in here. My pulse remained steady, my breathing remained steady, but something inside me became very clear. Because Denise wasn't preparing for a funeral, she was preparing for a transfer, and according to the records sitting inside box 314, the transfer had never been hers to receive. Somewhere above us, a vault door closed with a heavy metallic thud. Some people imagine life-changing documents as dramatic things. Thick envelopes, red stamps, bold headlines. The reality is usually much less impressive. Paper, ink, signatures, dates. The things people ignore until they matter. Eleanor opened the large envelope first. Inside were 14 separate documents, each tabbed, each numbered, each cross-referenced, exactly the way I would have organized them. The first document explained everything. It was an irrevocable trust, created 5 years and 8 months earlier, modified twice, reviewed annually, still active, still enforceable, still completely unknown to Denise. I read every page, then read them again, because the structure was brilliant, simple, clean, legally difficult to challenge. The family home had been transferred into the trust years ago. The 6 acres surrounding it, the workshop, the construction company, 3 investment accounts, 2 certificates of deposit, everything. Not after Harold's death. Before it. Long before it. Ownership had already changed. The paperwork had simply remained private. The second document mattered even more. A notarized statement. 7 pages. Signed by my father. Witnessed by Eleanor. Recorded with supporting documentation. In it, Harold described specific concerns regarding Denise's financial behavior. Not accusations. Observations. Dates. Conversations. Requests. Patterns. Exactly the kind of language attorneys love, because facts age better than emotions. I turned another page, then another, then stopped, because there was Gerald's name. Not once, 9 times, 9 separate references, 9 separate records, and suddenly everything began fitting together. The wedding venue, the inheritance conversations, the urgency, the assumptions, the confidence. Harold had noticed it too, years ago. According to his notes, Denise and Gerald had maintained contact throughout most of her marriage. Nothing romantic appeared in the documentation. Nothing scandalous. Just enough communication to raise questions. Enough to justify preparation. Enough to justify protection. Then Eleanor handed me the flash drive. Open the folder marked Financial. I did. 342 files. Emails. Bank records. Property inquiries. Insurance correspondence. Everything categorized. Everything dated. Everything preserved. And sitting in the middle of it all was a spreadsheet. A spreadsheet Denise had created. My stomach tightened. Not emotionally. Professionally. Because I recognized the structure immediately. Asset projection model. The kind investors use. The kind acquisition firms use. The kind people use when estimating future control of assets. Rows. Columns. Projected values. Estimated liquidation schedules. Future ownership assumptions. The file was dated almost 6 years earlier. 6 years earlier. Before the first heart scare. Before the hospitalizations. Before anyone expected Harold to die. The final column carried a title. Expected transfer timeline. I stared at it for several seconds. Then closed my eyes. Not because I was shocked. Because I finally understood why my father had created the trust. Denise wasn't planning for loss. She was planning for acquisition. And Harold had seen it. Years before anyone else. Eleanor slid the final envelope toward me. The one with my name on it. I opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter. 3 pages. The handwriting was shakier than I remembered, but it was undeniably his. Vivian, if you're reading this, Denise has probably convinced herself she knows what's inside this box. That's been her mistake for years. She assumes information belongs to the person standing closest to it. You've always known better. Information belongs to the person who keeps it. I smiled despite myself. That sounded exactly like him. The letter continued. If she tries to control the funeral, let her. If she tries to control the story, let her. If she tries to control the room, let her. Paper is patient. Eventually, everyone reaches the page that matters. I stopped reading. The silence inside the vault room felt different now. Not heavy. Certain. The way a locked door feels when you already have the key. Then I reached the final paragraph, and everything became clear. The trust named me sole successor trustee, effective immediately upon Harold's death. Not later. Not after probate. Immediately. Every major decision, every property decision, every business decision, every trust decision, mine, legally, automatically, without court approval, without family approval, without Denise. The numbers were staggering. Combined asset value, $4.8 million. Not billionaire money, but enough. Enough to change lives. Enough to attract attention. Enough to explain Denise's confidence. And enough to explain why Harold had spent 6 years preparing. Eleanor closed the folder, then looked directly at me. Now you understand. I nodded. I do. The funeral was less than 24 hours away, and Denise still believed she was about to inherit nearly everything. She still believed she controlled the narrative. She still believed she controlled access. She still believed she controlled me. What she didn't realize was that every major decision she planned to make after the funeral required authority she didn't possess. Authority she had never possessed. Authority sitting quietly inside a trust document she had never seen. And that's when my phone vibrated. One new text message. From Denise. 3 words. Do not attend. I looked at the screen, then handed the phone to Eleanor. She read it, said nothing, just handed it back. Because some messages explain themselves, and some mistakes do too. Outside, snow slid from the bank roof and hit the pavement with a dull crack because she still thought she was holding the winning hand. I looked at Denise, then at the chapel doors, then back at Denise. The crowd around us had grown larger. I counted 31 people within earshot. Church members, former employees, neighbors, relatives. The audience Denise wanted, and unfortunately for her, audiences tend to remember endings more than performances. You received my text. I did. And yet you're here. Yes. Her jaw tightened. You are not welcome. The sentence came out louder than before. A deliberate choice. She wanted witnesses. She got them. I am Harold's daughter, I said. I was his wife. There it was. Possession. Again. Not grief. Not loss. Ownership. The same theme she had been repeating for years. Several people shifted uncomfortably. One of my father's former foremen looked down at the pavement. Another crossed his arms. Nobody intervened. Not yet. Denise took another step forward. Harold trusted me with everything. I noticed something then. Not what she said. What she didn't say. She wasn't talking about my father anymore. She was talking about control. The difference matters. I kept my voice level. Everything? Everything. You're sure? Her chin lifted. Absolutely. The answer arrived too quickly, like someone answering from memory instead of truth. Beside me, Eleanor quietly opened her folder. The sound of paper sliding against paper seemed strangely loud. Denise noticed. For the first time, uncertainty appeared. Tiny, but visible. What is that? Eleanor didn't answer. She simply handed me the first document. Certified trust summary. County recording stamp. Execution date. Verification number. Every piece of information exactly where it belonged. I held it out. Denise hesitated, then took it. The crowd remained silent. The only sound came from rain striking the chapel windows. Tick, tick, tick. At first she skimmed. Then she read. Then she stopped. Her eyes returned to the top of the page. Again. Then again. The confidence began draining from her posture. Not dramatically. Gradually. Like air leaving a tire. This doesn't mean anything. The statement sounded weaker than she intended. It means ownership changed years ago, Eleanor said. Several people exchanged glances. One church elder adjusted his glasses and stepped closer. Now Denise turned pages faster. Searching, hunting, looking for a mistake. But documents don't become wrong because somebody dislikes them. Then she reached the final page. The trustee designation. My name. Large, clear, unavoidable. For the first time all afternoon she stopped speaking. Completely. I counted. 1 second. 2, 3, 4, 5. Then she laughed. Short, sharp, forced. This isn't what Harold wanted. A new voice answered before I could. No. Everyone turned. The speaker was Frank Mercer, standing near the chapel steps, hands in his coat pockets, rainwater glistening on his shoulders. He signed it. Frank rarely spoke. That was why people listened when he did. The silence afterward felt enormous. Then Denise made the biggest mistake of the day. She looked toward the crowd, toward the people she thought would support her, and she said, Harold promised me this house. Promised. Not owned. Not documented. Promised. A dangerous word when paperwork enters the conversation. Eleanor reached into her folder again. This time she removed the letter. The handwritten letter. My father's final insurance policy against revisionist history. And everything changed. Eleanor didn't make a speech. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't ask for attention. She simply walked to the registration table and placed the letter there. 3 pages. 1 life. 6 years of preparation. The movement took less than 3 seconds, yet somehow the entire crowd shifted toward it. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The rain softened outside. Even the chapel seemed quieter. Then Eleanor stepped back, looked at me, and nodded once. That was it. No words, no instructions, no performance. Just a nod. But in that nod existed 6 years of preparation, 6 years of records, 6 years of patience, 6 years of my father refusing to leave anything to assumption. I picked up the letter. My hands remained steady. The paper felt thin, ordinary, the way important things often do. Then I began reading. The first paragraph explained why the trust existed. The second explained why it had been hidden. The third changed the room. If Denise is reading this, then she has probably spent years assuming proximity creates ownership. It does not. Documentation creates ownership. Nobody moved. I continued. I have provided for Denise exactly as I intended. Nothing more, nothing less. Everything else has already been placed where it belongs. A sound escaped Denise. Not a word, not a sentence, just a small breath. The kind people make when a future disappears unexpectedly. Then I reached the final page, the page that mattered most, the page Harold knew would eventually arrive. If anyone tells you I wanted Vivian excluded from my funeral, they are lying. The sentence landed like a dropped weight. Complete silence. Several people looked directly at Denise. One woman covered her mouth. Someone near the chapel doors whispered, "Oh my God." And then came the final line, the one Harold saved for last. The person who spent years protecting this family was never the loudest person in the room. She was the one keeping the records. I lowered the letter. Across the parking lot, Gerald Whitmore had just arrived. Black SUV. Expensive suit. Perfect timing. Terrible luck. He had clearly expected a funeral. Instead, he arrived in the middle of a collapse. His eyes moved from Denise, to me, to Eleanor, to the trust documents, back to Denise. Nobody needed to explain. People understand body language faster than paperwork. "What happened?" he asked. Denise didn't answer. "What happened?" he repeated. Still nothing. Then Eleanor handed him the trust summary, and that was the exact moment Denise lost the room. Not when the documents appeared. Not when the letter was read. When Gerald stopped standing beside her and quietly stepped away. One step, then another, then another. The distance between them couldn't have been more than 6 feet, yet it felt like 6 miles. Outside, rain rolled steadily across the chapel roof. The funeral finally began 11 minutes late. Not because of weather, not because of logistics, because reality had interrupted the schedule. Eventually, people moved inside, quietly, slowly, like people leaving the scene of an accident they hadn't expected to witness. Nobody mentioned the trust. Nobody mentioned the confrontation. Not directly. Small towns rarely do. They simply remember. And Hollow Creek remembered everything. I sat in the front row. The seat I should have occupied from the beginning. Eleanor sat beside me. Frank sat 2 rows back. For the first time in days, nobody tried to stop me from being my father's daughter. The service itself was simple, exactly the way Harold would have wanted. No grand speeches, no dramatic displays, just stories, real stories. Stories about construction projects, fishing trips, broken tractors repaired for free, neighbors helped during storms, employees who became family, the actual man, not the version people tried to own after he died. When the service ended, people lined up to offer condolences. Some hugged me, some shook my hand, some simply nodded. A few apologized for believing Denise's version of events. I thanked them, then let it go, because people can only act on the information they have. The first real surprise came from my cousin Rachel. She found me standing near the cemetery gate after the burial. The ground was wet. The air smelled like rain and fresh earth. For several seconds she said nothing. Then finally she sighed. "I should have called you." I looked at her. She stared toward the headstone, not at me. I knew something felt wrong. Pause. I just didn't want conflict. That answer felt honest, painfully honest. And most people don't choose sides. They choose comfort. Sometimes that's worse. Sometimes it's simply human. Either way, I appreciated the truth. "I know," I said. Rachel nodded, then squeezed my shoulder once. Nothing dramatic. Nothing life-changing. Just a small crack of humanity. The first one I'd seen all week. Meanwhile, Denise disappeared. Not literally, just socially. The same people who had followed her instructions now avoided her calls. The same people who repeated her version of events stopped repeating it. Not because anyone attacked her, because records had arrived. And records tend to end arguments. 3 weeks later, Gerald Whitmore ended their engagement. Or whatever version of engagement had existed. Apparently, inheriting millions had been an important component of their future planning. Without that assumption, the future looked different. I only learned about it because somebody mentioned it at the diner. Small towns remain efficient information systems. Some things never change. The trust administration took 7 months. The business continued operating. The workshop remained standing. The property remained protected. Everything functioned exactly as my father intended. What surprised me most was what I chose not to do. Because legally, I had options. A lot of options. Eleanor outlined them carefully. Challenges, claims, recovery actions, additional investigations, more paperwork, more consequences, more pain, all available, all legal, all possible. I considered them, then declined. Not because Denise deserved kindness, because I was tired. Not physically, emotionally. I had spent years documenting, years preparing, years watching. At some point, accountability had already happened. The records existed. The truth existed. The outcome existed. Anything beyond that felt unnecessary. My father had prepared for protection, not punishment. There is a difference. The last time I saw Denise was 8 months later, at a grocery store, Tuesday afternoon, 2:16 p.m. I remember because I checked my receipt afterward. She looked older, not dramatically, just quieter. Life had removed something from her. Not money, certainty. For a moment I thought she might say something, apologize, explain, defend herself. Instead, she simply nodded, then walked away. No speech, no excuses, no performance, just silence. And somehow that felt more honest than anything she had said in years. I watched her leave, then returned to my shopping cart. Because some chapters don't end with justice. They end with distance. The automatic doors closed behind her with a soft hydraulic hiss. Losing my father hurt. Nothing changed that. Not the trust. Not the paperwork. Not the outcome. Not being right. The hardest part wasn't the funeral. It wasn't Denise. It wasn't even the betrayal. The hardest part was accepting that preparation cannot save relationships that other people are determined to damage. For a long time, I thought if I documented enough, explained enough, worked hard enough, eventually everyone would see the truth. What I learned instead is that some people already see the truth. They simply prefer a version that benefits them. That's why records matter. Not because they change people, because they protect reality when people try to rewrite it. My father understood that before I did. And in the end, His preparation gave me something far more valuable than money. It gave me certainty. So I'm curious. Have you ever watched someone try to rewrite family history while the facts were sitting right there in front of them? Let me know in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe if you haven't already. It helps more than you know. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one.